Testing.
Very much so is the problem. So, good evening. I was about to say good morning. Here we are getting towards the very end of our summer series, which has been an amazing series, I think. We've had a lot of great guests. We've heard some familiar voices and some new voices. And tonight we get kind of a combination of the two. Someone who's not been here with this before, but has been our pastor now almost a month. So, yeah. So, and I when I introduced him that first Sunday, I said I probably wouldn't do this again, but I'll do it one more time here. The Reverend Dr. Hunter Cummings, because we're going to talk a bit about your dissertation here and the thing that you wrote about when we indulge us in this wonderful discussion. And just so that you all know, this kind of stuff that we're going to talk about tonight, Practicing Mercy with John Wesley and medieval wall murals, excites me just as much as when Nick Polk comes to talk about Tolkien or Caleb Haynes comes and talks about creation care. All of these are such amazing things that we can hear, and we get to hear some really good voices. And so be sure to come back next week. Dr. Stan Wilson's coming. He is actually the first person that's going to be here in one of this series of the last 3 years who actually knew me before I was a Nazarene. So he and I went to college together. So you're going to hear a bit about him. He's the spiritual formation minister at Hendersonville Church of Christ. And he's going to talk about spiritual formation and how we form in the things we do. And part of that is him talking about his experience filming The Chosen. So they just finished Wrapped season 6. And he and his wife have been extras for the last few years. So they'll talk about that, their interaction with the filmmakers and with the cast and with the spiritual formation that actually goes on in the filming of that series. So looking forward to that. But tonight, we have Pastor Hunter. I'm gonna stop with the fancy titles for now. But he's going to be talking to us, like I said, about practicing mercy with John Wesley and medieval wall murals. And I'm just fascinated how you're going to connect these two, because I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit how I got involved in this kind of weird subject. I was a youth pastor at Radnor Church of the Nazarene off Nolensville Road, and my office flooded with water, and I had to move over next door to Music City Mission. And so I got involved. Let me see, click this on. I may have to turn this on. Here. It didn't work this time. I probably messed it up. Well, I got involved when the office flooded. I moved next door, got involved in Music City Mission, and it was a food pantry, a clothing closet, and we got to meet a lot of people coming from Cuba at the time. There were a lot of people moving to the Nashville area from Cuba, and so some people's first conversations outside the airport were at Music City Mission getting clothes. And so I was a youth pastor at the church next door, and so I got our youth group involved with a lot of the work of Music City Mission. And that was kind of how I got introduced into doing compassionate ministry through food and clothing and resources and stuff like that. And so after that, I ended up getting to work at East Nashville Cooperative Ministry. Some of you may know where that used to be on East Main Street. It's now a hot yoga studio with hotels on either side of it. But every Monday morning, we used to have two 18-wheelers from Second Harvest of Middle Tennessee pull up and unload pallet after pallet of food. And so I got my feet not just wet, I was all in at that point in compassionate ministry. We fed the homeless with lunches. We had a Sunday night ministry, kind of similar to the Emmaus ministry at Nashville First. And just a lot of food and shelter and connecting people with resources. And as I got involved with Nashville's kind of nonprofit faith-based nonprofit sector, I started realizing a lot of people are doing the same stuff. And sometimes the state of Tennessee is involved, sometimes the federal government's involved, sometimes churches are involved, and sometimes there's duplication of, services. And so I started kind of pondering this question out loud, and that's a picture of a garden that we planted out back. And that's kind of a fun story how that garden got going. Caleb Haynes would have really enjoyed this story. I was told nothing would ever grow there because there were metal I-beams and plumbing parts and asbestos. Like there were bags that said asbestos on the side of the bags that we found in the roof of that building. And I was kind of disappointed that we were not going to be able to plant a garden. And Tony Emanuel of the Nashville Mulch Company asked if he could meet the director. He came back to my office. I showed him out my prison windows. At the time, we still had prison bars on all the windows, about what had happened. And he said, well, I own the Nashville Mulch Company. He goes, tell me what you need, and I'll have it out here. And by the end of that week, he brought dump load after dump load of real good topsoil, organic, and that's kind of how we got the garden going there. But the question I started asking at this point in my life was, how does a local church work with nonprofits and government to help people? How do nonprofit organizations, local churches, and the government, how can they all work together to feed people and clothe people? Do this kind of stuff. And so that led me to John Wesley. I started reading stuff that John Wesley had said in letters and in sermons. Started reading books about prison reform, about micro-lending before it was called micro-lending, how he used Sunday school offerings to put people to work. And I'll just give you a little sample of some of the things that piqued my interest. Wesley wrote, I visited as many as I could of the sick. How much better is it when it can be done to carry relief to the poor than to send it? And that both for our own sake and theirs. For theirs, as it is so much more comfortable to them, and as we may then assist them in spirituals as well as temporals. So temporals means like your body, like the food, the clothing, all that stuff. And so, it makes sense, It's one thing to send money to a group, but it's better when you can actually take the aid there yourself. You get to rub shoulders with people, right? And so Wesley had this strong belief that when we practiced good unto other people through these works of mercy, that it changed us in a very deep and powerful way, in a spiritual way. So he said, as for our own, as it is far more apt to soften our heart and make us more naturally care for each other. So you'll hear him preach a sermon on visiting the sick, visiting the poor. He required all the early Methodist ministers to visit the poor so often, and not just their door. He wanted you to be like in the home, sitting in the squalor, being exposed to diseases and critters and things like that. That it naturally broke down walls between the people that they were trying to minister to, but it developed empathy, compassion, a different perspective. And so he kind of did this kind of stuff to an extreme. At Oxford, he began kind of mentoring a group of students, and one of them ended up dying. We don't know for sure what all medical reasons were involved, but he had college students that were fasting. They were giving up their food and pooling the money and buying books to teach little children how to read. or they would skip their meals and pool the money and then go and feed people. And so they were being kind of extreme in terms of how much what they might consider charity or alms deeds, works of mercy, they were doing. But he believed it was a Methodist, right? He believed there was a method whereby we can grow in holiness and Christ-likeness. So I ended up going to the Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, north of England. I got to have access to John Wesley's letters, and I was interested in his financial ledgers, and no one had really done work with the ledgers. And I wanted to see how the Methodist empire grew and how they were using these Sunday school offerings to start all these ministries up all over London and up north in Newcastle and even over in Ireland. At one point, his brother's Charles is writing a letter to John saying, you've gone too far with these offerings. Like, you're taking up so many offerings, we're giving it back to the people that are giving it, You're just taking up offering after offering for all these programs and things, and it's going right back to the people that are giving. But one thing I thought kind of was interesting about Wesley's economic ethic was he believed there was always someone wealthier than you, and there was always someone poorer than you. So you absolutely had a right to ask a homeless person to give to something, because as bad as they had it, there was probably someone that had it even worse. And it's a joy for everyone to give, no matter where they're at. So very much a different way of thinking about economics. He's living at the same time that Adam Smith is starting to write about capitalism, and you're starting to get the emergence of a middle class. Some people think that Wesley and the Methodists prevented a bloody French Revolution from happening in England. You all know about the French Revolution, right? Well, the emergence of the middle class came about in large part by the Methodist movement and him teaching people, save all you can, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So what I want to do now is kind of show you some pictures. Let me read one more quote. This is what he wrote to the church stewards. So these were people that collected the Sunday school offerings. So they would have these small groups and bands organized throughout the city, and they might meet at a factory after they all got off work from the factory. And they would give little small offerings together, and then the steward would decide who in their society was really going through a hard time and needed the money, right? And this was an instruction he gave to the stewards. If you cannot relieve, do not grieve the poor. Give them soft words, if nothing else. Abstain from either sour looks or harsh words. Let them be glad to come, even though they should go away empty. Put yourself in the place of every poor man and deal with him as you would God should deal with you. And that's a statue of John Wesley down in Savannah, Georgia. He was in Georgia for a little under 2 years. So works of mercy and where they might fit kind of into our church or into your life. If you're like me, if you grew up Protestant evangelical, you heard a bunch of sermons that talked about reading your Bible and praying. If you want to get close to God, read your Bible, pray, go to church services. These are the primary ways that we grow, okay? He would call those things works of piety. They come out of the pietist movement, where there was an emphasis on personal devotion, a personal relationship with God. What you, not as a group, but as an individual, can do to grow closer to God through practices, maybe even eventually journaling and types of meditation, but normally prayer, reading spiritual works, devotional works of literature, stuff like that. So that's what he means by works of piety. So in this famous sermon on zeal, Wesley writes, "Thine, Lord, is wisdom, thine alone. Justice and truth stand before thee stand. Yet nearer to thy sacred throne, mercy withholds thy lifted hand. And he goes on and he talks about how as you get closer to the throne room of God and the very heart of God the Father, you have works of piety, praying, reading your Bible, reading devotional works, going to church. But then he says these are not as important as the works of mercy, doing things unto the least of these, feeding people, clothing people, giving people water that are thirsty, housing people who are homeless, rescuing or ransoming people who are in prison. And so he then says that these works of mercy produce in us holy tempers. Think of tempers as like dispositions. So what is your disposition towards a homeless person? Or what is your disposition to someone on part of a welfare program? Or someone that comes soliciting or someone panhandling? What is your disposition towards people that are in need like this? And so he thought that when you do these works of mercy, they begin to change your disposition and your temperament toward people in need, and that it produces a holy love that's the same as the love of Christ within you. So these works of mercy. So as I read,
I have a question about that, just real quick. So what you're telling us with this chart is that works of mercy are closer to the heart of holiness than works of piety.
That's what Wesley taught. And I know that's kind of different than maybe what churches may have emphasized, depending on what church you grew up with. And I'm not saying it's right. It's just what Wesley thought that, and he was he was born in 1703. So in the 18th century was an age of empiricism. So it was a return to Aristotle of let's test and experiment with everything. So Wesley was very experimental in how he saw people grow in their relationship with God. So if he saw someone that seemed really Christ-like, he would want to know, well, what did they do to become that way? Okay, well, if it worked for them, let's go test it with Pastor Brandon, or let's test it with this group of kids here. And he'd take notes, and okay, this religious practice yields this kind of result in spiritual development. So in his personal experience, he came to see that when he got people doing these works of mercy, they grew a lot deeper and a lot quicker in their walk with Christ than the other. And wasn't saying don't do works of piety. He just thought that the works of mercy were more important, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So and you guys stop me if you've got a question. I've got some questions for y'all here in a minute. But as I was reading more and more of his sermons and letters, I started noticing a pattern that he kept using this phrase, works of mercy. And I'd read a lot of books written in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that talked about Wesley's ministry to the poor and compassion, and was kind of using our kind of language for that kind of work. But I kept seeing Wesley kept using this word, works of mercy. And I wanted to know where he got that term and what it meant. And so that's where I eventually met this really boring guy, Thomas Aquinas. He was called the dumb ox by his friends growing up. He is one of the 4 doctors of the Roman Catholic Church. So if you're Roman Catholic, Thomas Aquinas is a really big deal. Some of y'all probably know some places that are named after Thomas Aquinas. He wrote this massive work there. You can see there those 4 books. And it's super boring to read. And it's systematic theology. And it's question, refutation, disputation, back and forth, back and forth. He makes all these lists. And everything's got nice, neat patterns of 7. Because 7's a good, biblical number, And so eventually, somewhere in the middle of all that craziness, he lists out the 7 works of mercy. And you probably, I don't know, can you see that picture? Is it big enough for you to see it? This is my favorite listing of it because it's kind of emoji, Legos looking, But everything has to be matchy-matchy. So if you have 7 bodily works of mercy, you got to have 7 spiritual works of mercy. And so these 7 bodily ones or corporal ones, 6 are based off Matthew 25. The least of these, you might remember that in the Gospel of Matthew, where they say, Lord, when did we see you naked? Or when did we see you in prison? Or when did we do this? And he says, well, truly I tell you, when you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. It's the one time Jesus gives us a real clear cut, here's what you're going to be judged by one day. These things, right? Well, for most of church history, for the Reformation especially, the church just took Jesus at his word there, literally, and said, okay, if Jesus said this stuff's really important, this is what we're going to be judged by, this is very, very important for Christians to do these things. Because Jesus never said, if you pray this prayer, or if you do this thing, or you invite me into your heart, these kinds of things. The one time he gets real explicit is in Matthew 25, and he says 6 of those 7 things. Can anyone read the last one? What's the last one on there, on the body side? Yes. So that's from the Apocrypha, a book that's from the book of Tobit, which is part of the Apocrypha. Protestants don't have that in their Bible, but Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox do. And there's a book in the Apocrypha, that's the books in between the Old and New Testament. If you really like the King James Version, the original KJV had the Apocrypha in it. So if you really want to mess with someone who's a KJV only, and that's the only translation, you just ask them if they've seen the original King James Version. And you can show them that there's the Apocrypha in there, and that'll lead to some real good religious discussions. But the book of Tobit is this big, long story about a guy who makes a lot of sacrifices to bury someone out of love. If you think about a world, or even think about wartime, no man left behind, soldiers going back to retrieve a fallen comrade, that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of sacrifice, doesn't it? In a day and age where you don't have funeral parlors or industrial equipment, to take time to dig a hole and bury someone, it's a work of love, right? It's a work of mercy to do that. If you're a church and you build a big church facility to plan out a churchyard and have a headstone or a gravestone, tombstone, for us Americans, it's this industrial complex, right? The funeral industry. But before that was a thing, there was a lot that went into giving someone a proper burial. So that's the 7th one that Aquinas tacks on. The 7 spiritual ones are really fun to talk about, especially the first one, instructing the ignorant. That's a mercy when you take the time to try to help somebody figure something out they should know how to do for themselves, right? You're showing someone mercy when you teach them how to do something that they don't know how to do, right? Say you're having a conversation with someone about some issue, and it's clear to you that their perception on the issue, they may not know all the facts, or they may not have explored different sides. In that moment, maybe they have not had the same life experiences you've had, or the same education, or maybe they've not traveled and seen different parts of the world. And so being able to share different perspectives with different people in a way that's not arrogant becomes a work of mercy. All of these have scriptural references. So the spiritual side one, it's mainly Paul's letters in the New Testament. Different passages support these acts. So counsel the doubtful, admonish sinners. Your English Bible may say rebuke, reprove, chide. We're called, when we see our brothers and sisters caught in a sin, we're called to address it, right? Sometimes we're supposed to gently say, hey, that's gossiping, or hey, you're lying, or, hey, that's admonishing the sinner. And that's a merciful thing, trying to save someone from sin, right? Forgive offenses, comfort the afflicted. Ooh, this last one's fun. Bear wrongs patiently. When people wrong you, whether they straight up backstab you or they just rub you a little the wrong way, or they're just kind of rude to you. That's mercy, when you bear those wrongs patiently. And then the last one, this is my unedited version. I have photoshopped "and the dead" off of the one that I like to use a lot. Pray for the living. So Protestants, we don't believe in praying for the dead, right? But the original Thomas Aquinas list, this was part of it. So these are the works of mercy. So now that you know what they are, I now started to understand why, when Wesley said works of mercy, this is what he's talking about. So he's telling the early Methodists, do these practices and you'll grow in holiness. Some places he goes so much to say, do these practices and it'll lead to your salvation. Wesley frequently got accused of works righteousness and of popery, which was like a slam on Roman Catholicism. He was Protestant. He believed we're saved by grace, by faith, through Christ alone. But he so strongly emphasized practicing these things that sometimes people said, you're teaching that we save ourselves. That's not what he was saying. He was saying when you do these things, it's like you're saving yourself from selfishness. When you do these things, they have a salvific effect on you. Now, more than salvation, he would say these things sanctify you. When he talks about Christian perfection, what we Nazarenes talk about, entire sanctification, he said these were primary means whereby God sanctifies us. God makes us holy as we learn to practice these things, right? And that makes sense, right? The first time you turn the other cheek or respond with kindness when someone's yelling at you, you do that over time, you become more Christ-like, a sanctifying effect. So we live in a merciless world, right? A world that's kind of devoid of mercy. Where do you guys see kind of a lack of mercy in our world? Just raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. Where do you, when you think about the world being maybe a merciless place, can you think of any examples? Yeah. War, okay. Yeah. The homelessness, okay. So we'll go back to war and homelessness. With war, would there be a way to show mercy within war, maybe? And homelessness, let me clarify. Are you guys saying the fact that there is war means we lack mercy towards other nations or people groups?
I'm just thinking that in war, the parties involved engaged in war throw off any concepts of mercy relative to the civilians on the other side.
Okay.
Example. And we've seen that over and over
Sure.
and over, and we're seeing it today.
Sure. That's good. Thank you. Yeah. And with the homeless, Darlene, would you say the fact that homelessness exists, or how homeless are treated, or what? If I have to, you have to.
How the homeless are treated, and they set up shelters for themselves in tents, and now they're being told to clear those tents, but not given any suggestion where to go.
To piggyback off that, I think we waste so much money on things we really don't need, that there's just such a lack of shelters, of help for people. the children who are in homeless shelters. This should not happen, but I'm sorry, I might step on toes, but we're building a new stadium. That bothers me.
So our posture towards certain people groups, maybe when there's a worldwide event like a war or something, certain practices fly out the window. And Karen saying like resources, how we use resources, merciless world. What about the news cycles themselves with celebrities or politicians? You think about piranhas of, one fall from grace, right? One mistake, or you uncover this person 40 years ago did this or that. Now, I'm not saying that when people break the law or whatever, we shouldn't talk about it, and it shouldn't be brought up, but even the way that the general public, we talk about these things in the media and news cycles and stuff, sometimes it almost feels like a piranha kind of thing when someone has a fall, maybe.
Yeah, and I think feeding off of that, the way social media can be,
that's
other
great.
things where
Oh, yeah.
where the clickbait headlines or even just the way people lead is, well, this person owned this other person. And you're like, "Oh, really? But those kind of words too, that kind of attitude of, I must vanquish the one who disagrees with me rather than try to find why or things like that. I think that's a sign of a merciless way of interacting. And I think the church is often guilty of that.
Absolutely. Anybody else, merciless ways you see the world being merciless?
Yes.
I was just thinking that to me, when I hear that, when you see lack of mercy, I think that there is a lack of humility that goes prior to that. Because if I think everything revolves around me, or I think I'm always right, or everything about me is the most important, it's kind of hard to get outside of that. And so it's going to keep me from acting in ways of mercy. It's going to keep me from thinking outside of myself. When I'm in a political argument or even in acting as our politicians, it's very rare to see politicians, especially right now, it seems, that have humility, that come into conversations with humility. And so therefore, how is it even possible to start caring about people when it's just all about me? And how is it possible to have, with the chart you had up earlier, that was the one thing when I was reading through, especially the spiritual side, educating the ignorant. I mean, if you really care about doing that,
Right, there's a way to do it. Yeah.
and it being effective, you're going to have to do it in a humble way. And so to me, that's a big problem that we have today in so many arenas, is a lack of humility.
That's good. Thank you.
I know you said to think of someone always better off than you and less than you, but I think our whole perspective of that has changed, where we know people are better off than us, but then we are envious of what they have. And then those who have less, we then booster ourselves up and think less of them.
Jump back on mine, and could it be because we think that we've made, I'm better off because I've made better decisions. So therefore, again, back to that lack of humility.
Our team's done.
That's good. That's good, y'all. Yeah. So one of the things about practicing these is it puts you in close proximity to people, relationally, emotionally, physically. Wesley was all about like getting into their habitat, like getting into their home. Now, the 18th century William Hogarth. There's different print drawings. The famous one is the one on gin, where a mom's, got a baby falling out of her arms. Like the 18th century in England, like gin was the alcoholic drink. Gin was leading to a lot of vices and destructive habits. And I mean, the prisons were, they didn't have a lot of the kind of checks that we might think of in our modern society today, right? So the poor really were living in utter like squalor, right? That we would think of. And so when he's saying like go into their house, like there were certain segments of society that had gotten to where they wouldn't even be, Manchester in the 18th century eventually built a road system in such a way where the upper classes would never even have to go anywhere near in the city where the factory workers, were working and whatnot. So I think that's kind of getting at what Pastor Terry and Courtney are talking about is it's easy to make the assumptions about them. It's easy to make assumptions about yourself. But when you enter into a relationship, I think that can have the potential to break down some of the false assumptions about the folks you're working with and about yourself. You see the thumbs up, thumbs down. I started eventually researching clemency rates and pardons, and that's really fascinating to look at how presidential pardons have changed in the United States. I came across a really interesting English concept that England practiced mercy in a way different than other European nation states. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So they had really, really old laws on the book that almost seemed ancient or barbaric. Like if you're stealing, you get your hand cut off. And other countries would be changing these laws to maybe make them more merciful. But England had this practice where the judges would never throw the whole book, the whole letter of the law. So their laws were very, very, very strict. The punishments were. But in practice, the judges and the society had this way of not applying the full letter. So one way you can think about mercy is not getting what you deserve. So you broke the law, you did this. Is mercy just not getting what you deserve? So some people would say, would define grace as getting good stuff that we don't deserve, and mercy as not getting the bad stuff that we do deserve. So let's do a little etymology, word study, fun stuff here. So I found out that mercy took this wild journey on how we came to have this English word mercy that doesn't at all resemble what it meant in the Old Testament in the Hebrew or even the New Testament Greek. The closest ancestors to our English word for mercy come out of Anglo-Saxon and French and going all the way back there to the Latin. Mercs, mercantile, merchandise, Mercedes, like Mercedes-Benz, a luxury car. This is the etymology of the English word mercy. And I think it's really telling where that word has gone, right? When you think about merchandise, you think about a transaction. You think about goods that can be received and exchanged, right? And so is mercy a Roman emperor saying, you get to live or you get to die? Well, that's how the pagans thought about mercy. If you read Homer and the Odyssey, and you read stuff about the ancient Greek gods and even Roman gods and goddesses, all of religion was about trying to appease them so they would give you this in the end instead of this in the end. It was totally transactional. You do this ritual, you do a little dance, you throw a little money in the thing, or you do this, and maybe the gods would show you mercy. That's a transaction, right? In Hebrew, the Hebrew words for mercy were more relational, and they had connotations of like a mother's womb and a tenderness and a compassion. That's a very different understanding of mercy than a transactional kind of almost like a legal, understanding of mercy. So I like this quote. Jaron Rao is the president of Nazarene Theological Seminary. He says, "The Church of the Nazarene is at its best when we're loving the people no one else seems to love and meeting the needs no one else seems to be meeting." So kind of how I want to end tonight kind of is to start thinking about how we as the Church of the Nazarene are doing those things. That's how we started, right? Those of you that know our history, we started out in Los Angeles, and even the Pentecostal mission here in Nashville, we started out as a people very much who found our primary ministries and identities as meeting needs, in our community. And so as you think about all these different works of mercy, the ones to the body and the ones to the soul, I don't like necessarily that strict, bifurcation of those, but that's how Aquinas made these two lists, right? They obviously go hand in hand, right? You can practice them all, the same time. But as you think about how we could practice them together as a church, I want to take you on a little journey through some of the Anglican parish churches that have been there for hundreds of years. So this is a map of some churches that Courtney and I have visited. I drug my wife on a trip. She drove. She was our driver. But we went to some of these churches that are called redundant churches. Now, the Church of England now calls them just closed churches. It's kind of interesting. They were redundant a long time before they became closed. There's a lesson there. But these are churches that are protected. They cannot bulldoze them down. And so they just sit there, whether they have the funds to keep them up or not. And oftentimes they're in little remote villages, and one or two villagers, they'll go and try to fix them up, put a tarp over a hole in the roof, or they're not locked. There's no locks on the doors. They're wide open. They got a little money box that you just put money in if you want to try to help pay for the roof to be restored. And they just try to keep the wild animals out and keep them up the best they can with no funding, no support, anything. And they're all over the countryside, and they're called redundant churches because they want to preserve them because they're beautiful architecture. But the population centers have moved away. Now the ones in urban centers, they might become a bank or a business or a concert or a pub or something like that. But the ones out in the villages, they just kind of leave them there. So we went on a little journey going to these churches, and I found that the works of mercy were painted all over these churches from about the time of the Norman Conquest all the way up to the English Reformation. This was a very popular theme in mural art. They would have the 7 deadly sins as well. But the 7 works of mercy, they were the fad. They were the trend. Now, unfortunately, I found out halfway through my dissertation that these walls were plastered over white, and so Wesley would have never seen these. But his grandparents would have. And they're right there underneath all that whitewashing, where they said, we're getting rid of all this potpourri. And they just painted all the walls white and painted all over these murals and made them really boring whitewashed churches. Well, over time, as that whitewash faded and crumbled, villagers and people will go in and they'll try to restore these. And it's pretty much every old Anglican church has these wall murals. And so that's the west wall as you leave the church. So imagine if every Sunday as you left, you had this big reminder to do these works of mercy. Sometimes in the middle there's a man called Every Man, or sometimes the man's name was Good Deeds. That was their character. Sometimes it would be a woman. Sometimes it would be Christ himself, and you know it's Christ because there's a crown or there's a cross or it's got a halo or something. Isn't that interesting that you don't know? Is it Christ doing these works of mercy, or is it one of you? When we do them on the least of these, are we really doing them to that man or woman, or as Jesus said, are we doing it directly to Jesus. And so it's interesting, even in the art, that there's this kind of mystery of who's at the center of doing these works of mercy. Jesus, a man, a woman. Sometimes they're paired opposite of the 7 deadly sins, almost saying, okay, if you struggle with greed or lust or envy or jealousy or all these things, if you practice these works of mercy, it's an antidote to the deadliness of the sins. So look around this room we're in now. Imagine that wall there had a big picture of the 7 works of mercy: feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, drink to the thirsty, harboring the harborless or housing the stranger. Ransoming the prisoner is a fun one for me, because sometimes it's a jailbreak. It's breaking people out of jail. Sometimes it's just visiting the prisoner, so pick how extreme you want to do the ransoming the prisoner one, But if you were to ask Sabrina to paint a mural on this wall here to represent the 7 works of mercy, I don't think we have people in Hendersonville that are naked or naked. We don't live in an environment where people maybe are dying of water, because we have clean water here. So use your imaginations. What could those 7 bodily ones look like in our context? How could we as a church or individual Christians practice these things? How would Sabrina paint them on the wall, if you will? If there was a circle for feed the hungry, what might that look like? Just shout out ideas. Food pantry? Maybe a picture of Joyce and Christy with food boxes going out our front doors or something cool. That's cool. I like that. That's a good one. Any ideas for burying the dead? Bring out your dead. or any of them. And if you want to go over the spiritual ones, you can. Instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful. And maybe that could be an alpha ministry or yeah.
Yeah, I might put a picture of Pastor Terry teaching
Okay,
somebody.
Pastor Terry teaching someone. Cool.
Somebody who was ignorant. Yeah.
I love it.
No. I wasn't saying anybody in particular. So.
Well, these works, they were at the heart of the Anglican Church for half a millennia. They were in sermons. They were the main ministry of the church. There wasn't, not that kids ministry is bad, but there wasn't kids ministry, youth ministry, Sunday school, all the ministries we have today. The only ministries was doing these things, and that's why you collected money for the poor box offering. Now remember, this is a time before the government did anything. So the church wasn't redundant because the church didn't do these things. Civilization collapsed, it was really rough. And so what led me down this research path originally was, how do churches, the government, nonprofits, how do we all work together, to do these things? Have we gotten so much to where the church is just the government's got way more money? Or these big nonprofits, they do it way better than we can, our little congregation. And so is it something that these have disappeared, not just from the walls of the church, but from, the heart of the church, even the Church of the Nazarene? What could be some low-hanging fruit? This one's, I think, in Norfolk, and it's got a tree, and it's got each of the works of mercy as a fruit that the Holy Spirit's producing, in our lives. Would there be any kind of low-hanging fruit that might be some easy ways for us to, practice some of the works of mercy. That's a bad picture. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's getting over in the spiritual side of things, right? Big time. And sometimes doing that, we learn of the temporal needs and the bodily ones. Yeah. Let me see if I can go back to the list. Just had to show my beautiful wife and I trespassing through cornfields. Yeah, some of them, there wasn't like roads to them. You just had to go out in a cornfield to find these churches and find a door and just, you knock as if someone's going to be in there. And you're like, oh, they don't even lock these. They just open them up. Breaking someone out of jail, yeah. I'll go back to the list, and that way. So there they all are. And again, Cyprian, there's church fathers in the 3rd century that start talking about these in more and more codified listing forms, but it's not really until scholasticism in the 12th century that we finally have this matchy 14 list, and then that becomes a big part of religion in the Church of England. And Wesley wants to revive it and sees, even though it's old and ancient, he doesn't see his clergy peers doing it. He doesn't see the church at large doing it. So he's challenging Christians in the Church of England to get back to these things. And the irony is, they're on the walls of their buildings. They've just not been able to see them for 100 years at that point because they've all been whitewashed over, if you will, You set me up for where I'm going in the conclusion here. That's perfect. Thank you, Pastor Terry. All right, let's end with going to the scriptures here. By the way, I love this one because this one, it's showing the exalted Christ. He's risen and he's ascending. And they're attaching the works of mercy to the exalted, ascending Christ. That is if like this is the height of Christ's glory, is when these things are being done. That this was the purpose why the Son of Man came to earth, was to do these works of mercy for humanity. So you could see here how maybe interesting that would be if during worship, or even Hoops Church, like these walls, I'm not saying we should paint these walls with all these things on them, but I'm just saying there'd be no escaping the centrality of it, and I had to include this. So this is women being sawn in two. They were gossiping, and so in hell a devil's sawing them in two because they were gossiping. So if that was like, on the wall next to a pew, that would really be a subtle message not to gossip in church, right? Okay. So these are some more close-ups of what they look like. That's burying the dead, or visiting the sick, and then it might quickly go into burying the dead. Did you know Luke's gospel has 2 good Samaritans? I'm going to tie this in with what Pastor Terry was saying about uncleanness. We'll do the one everybody knows first. On his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance, and they called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." They're unclean, right? When Jesus saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." There's a whole thing there. They're unclean. They're not able to show themselves to the priests, right? As they went, as they were going on the way, they were cleansed. And now they really can, do it. One of them, when he saw that he'd been healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and he thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. So we know the Good Samaritan one, right? But that's the other Samaritan. Jesus said, "We're not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give God praise? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." The Good Samaritan sees a need. The best Samaritan sees God at work. And I think that's the real gift that I've been given from studying John Wesley's emphasis on the works of ministry is it's that relational proximity of visiting the sick, visiting the, it's just like, now he didn't get married till much later in life, and he skipped his wife's own funeral. So, he wasn't a great family man, clearly, right? So not everyone can go as crazy as John Wesley did on this kind of stuff, right? And I don't think God's calling all of us to check off all 14 of these each week or each year, or maybe even our church, right? So this isn't a checklist that we've got to do all these things, right, in order, right? But when we do them in a way that's not just sending money, but when we're doing the things ourselves, we begin to see Christ in the face of these people. And Charles wrote a gajillion songs about seeing Jesus Christ in the face of the poor and the sick. And he wrote a bunch of songs for Holy Communion and pours in all the verses. This was a huge theme in a lot of Charles Wesley's hymns. Unfortunately, they didn't make the top 10, the ones we sing today, like Christ the Lord's risen today, because some of them are just, they don't sound that great. But they have beautiful theology in them about how when we're doing these things, we begin to see not only God using us and working through us, but we see God already at work in the life of the people that we're ministering to. And so that's what I was kind of saying about the Samaritan is that leper that went back, that recognized that God had done the work, that's the best Samaritan, kind of. So we got a little time left. Any kind of questions or anything you guys want to talk about with this kind of stuff?
Is because we're afraid that by stepping into those communities, rubbing shoulders with those people, that it will somehow sully us, whether that's physically or our reputation, when we're with the wrong people. And that makes me think of the woman with the bleeding issue. And the reason that she was supposed to tell people she was unclean is because they were afraid that if they touched her, that uncleanness would come to them. But in that story, we see that within the kingdom of God, with the power of God, it actually works the other way around. That when we rub shoulders with them, they're actually rubbing shoulders with Jesus. And it works backwards. The opportunity for them to become clean because they've encountered Christ in us. And if we really take our doctrine of prevenient grace the way we should, that we realize that we have rubbed shoulders with Jesus in that person as well. And it changes us.
That's really good. I think about if I hand a bottle of water to someone on the street, I think I'm helping them, or I feel good about myself, my first inclination is not, that's Jesus right there. But all through medieval time period, that's what they thought. Those alms when they gave alms, the almsgiving, they thought the poor and those asking for help were literally Jesus because of what Jesus taught in the Gospels. And so I think kind of to your point, it's a paradigm shift. It's a different way of seeing why we're doing compassion. We think we're doing it to alleviate poverty or to help people get to a certain place or to fix something, but it used to be you were doing it not to fix something, but because it puts you in proximity to Jesus Christ. So poverty isn't a war to be fought like LBJ, right? Or it's not a problem to be fixed. It's something that is an opportunity for us to come to know God. And that's a very different way of looking at it, I think. It's good.
It reminds me of former Nazarene pastor named Kevin Nye wrote a book called Grace Can Lead Us Home, which is a way of, he kind of turns on its head the way Christians should be responding to homeless populations. That's where he works. That's what he does. He was in Los Angeles when he wrote the book. He's in Minneapolis now. But he criticizes the way both the government and the church approach these populations because they don't approach with grace or with care. And he leans heavy into John Wesley and into our Wesleyan holiness roots as to how we should minister and the ways we should do things. That's very different from that transactional understanding,
Yeah, that's it,
which
yeah.
is what drives a lot of this. And
Yes.
I'm sure you found that with the
Yeah.
government, nonprofit, and faith-based, that there's still a transactional understanding a lot.
Yes.
I learned that when I was at Second Harvest myself, the ways that people would approach what we did, and even when groups would reach out to us for help, there was always this transactional understanding, and we would often have to say, no, that's not what this is about. This is about feeding hungry people. We don't care who they are. We don't care where they are. And so there are those that are working towards that, and I think that's what we as the church should be leading in terms of just doing these works regardless. Sometimes we start worrying about, well, how did people get there? Well, it doesn't matter. Maybe in terms of a systemic thing,
Right.
but how do we help? What can we do? What are the actions that we do? And sometimes it's little tiny little things
Yeah.
that we think don't make a difference. But we've seen that through the food pantry. I've seen it through other things with just the fact, and I think there when Wesley talked to his trustees, even if you don't have something, the way that you approach someone, no sour face.
Yeah.
I think don't look on with pity. When you treat someone else as a human being, that is one of the works of mercy, I would say, because it helps them to remember that they are also a human being and that we see them as us instead of them. So.
Amen. Yeah.
This has just been on my mind since you began. Back in the early 1900s, there was an influenza, and it was about 100 years before COVID. It was interesting how it was so close to 100 years. But I believe, I won't get all the details exactly right, but I believe my grandfather's brother, he was a preacher of the gospel. He was like in his early 20s, like 21 or something. And he felt compelled to go out and help these people who had the influenza. And his wife begged him not to, but he just said he had to. He had to go around and help these people, and he ended up getting it and dying at the age of 21. I think back to COVID, who of us would have walked into a house of someone who had COVID and tried to help them? Just thinking of that.
Thanks, Faye. Thanks for sharing that story.
One of your questions were, what are the needs of our community? And I think sometimes it's just being a community together. I'm going to brag on Pastor Mark and his hoops ministry. I know people hear that that's his basketball, but that is 90+% community people that are coming, guys of all ages, and doing a devotional and getting together, and they've formed this little community, and almost like a life group, I would say,
Yeah,
like a large life group.
absolutely, yeah.
But he's given them a safe spot to be and to, yes, play sports, but also just to be a community together.
All hearts are clear. I wanted to send you with a blessing. You know, this is where it's at, isn't it? The Beatitudes, what Jesus says about mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And so, as you go tonight, may Jesus bless you with mercy. May you continue to receive mercy from God. May you receive mercy from your boss, from your family members, and may you pass it on. May you be merciful to others. Amen. Go in his mercy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.